Hello, everyone, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace, FMEP. I'm Hilary Rantisi, a 2025 Fellow at FMEP. Today is August 14th, 2025, and I will be in conversation with Randa Wahbe. Randa is a recent PhD graduate in anthropology from Harvard and currently teaching at University of San Francisco. She's also involved with movement advocacy and supporting progressive groups in elevating their voices in the media. A more detailed bio will be included with this podcast. And as we start our conversation, I wanted to give some feedback and some background context that led to the topic of our conversation today. Many of our listeners are aware of the murder of Awdah Hathaleen on Monday, July 28th, which is just over 2 weeks ago in the village of Umm al Khair. He was killed by Yinon Levy, a known settler who was previously sanctioned by the Biden administration, but no longer by this current Trump administration. Awdah was known to many international activists as a leader in nonviolent activism in the communities of the Masafer Yatta that have been under constant threat of ethnic cleansing. And many of you are probably familiar of the film No Other Land that won the Oscar, and Awdah was also part of that film. Awdah was 31 years old and the father of 3 children. In addition to his activism, he was an English teacher. And it's almost a guarantee that anyone who has visited Umm al Khair has met Awdah. And so his killing has felt very personal to so many people around the world. The reason this is the leading up to our topic today is that Awdah's body was initially withheld by the Israeli authorities. They held his body unburied, undignified, saying that they would only release it to the family if the family agreed to bury him outside the village at night and with a very small number of attendees present. And so in response to this, the women of Umm al Khair, around 60 of them, held a hunger strike. I think this is unprecedented in Palestine, that the entire female population of a village goes on a hunger strike, demanding the release of the body of Awdah for a proper Muslim burial in the village. In addition to that, a case was submitted to Israel's High Court of Justice, demanding his body be released without preconditions. And many people around the world rallied in support of the hunger strike and a demand for justice. It's been amazing and quite heartwarming to see the outpouring of support and the love from the broader international community. Many feel that they knew Awdah personally, but also were enraged by this injustice. I know that at least 14 cities around the world, including Rome, New York, Boston, Chicago, Philly, Little Rock, and many, many others, created solidarity and mourning tents. Many of these are still continuing. Now, about a week ago today, on August 7th, Awdah's body was finally released, and Awdah was finally laid to rest in the village of Umm al Khair. The entrance to the village was closed by the military, so not many people from the outside could attend, but at least his family and the village members could bury him how they wanted to bury him. Now, Awdah's killer remains uninvestigated, unrestrained, and free to re-enter Umm al Khair, as he has done several times since his murder. So the injustice continues, but for now, there's some reprieve that Awdah's body has been returned, and he received the proper burial his family wanted for him. So this is the lead up to the conversation today. As the story was unfolding, I was in conversation with Randa about this common practice of Israeli authorities who retain bodies of killed Palestinians in what you can call as a corpse captivity policy. And Randa's PhD dissertation focused on this practice. And I thought it would be an opportunity to shed light on this practice that's familiar to many Palestinians, but possibly not known to broader audiences. So first, welcome, Randa. And I wanted to ask if you could just give us a bit more information about what this corpse captivity policy is, what's the history of it, and how is it being utilized by the Israeli authorities?
Thank you so much for covering this really critical issue, Hilary. As you mentioned, the corpse captivity policy is one that's often overlooked, but it's a really devastating policy that reveals how Israel tries to control every aspect of Palestinian life. So I'm really glad and grateful for the opportunity to shed light on this issue. And as you mentioned, first of all, Allah yarhamu Awdah, and I'm so relieved that he was able to be laid to rest in his village in Umm al Khair, and that his family was able to carry out that funeral and that burial in the way that they wanted. And what happened to Awdah is so commonplace these days for Palestinians, for them to, in their moment of incredible grief and mourning and shock about the loss of their loved ones, to also have to be negotiating with the Israeli state on being able to bury their dead and how they can bury it and when and who can attend the funeral. And this is all just a form of like how punishment extends from life to death. But historically, we can trace the captive corpse policy back to British colonial rule over Palestine. Actually, one of the earliest documented cases of corpse captivity is of three infamous Palestinian rebels. You might have heard of them, Fuad Hijazi, Mohammed Jamjoom, and Atal Zir. They're really venerated in Palestinian revolutionary history as anti-colonial resistors and as being heroic because they had been sentenced to death in Akka prison in 1930 for participating in the Burak uprising. And they, after they were condemned to death, the stories are that they were fighting each other for who would go to the gallows first because they were ready to sacrifice their lives for the Palestinian cause. And actually, this is one of the most earliest documented cases of the use of corpse captivity against Palestinians. There were huge crowds of Palestinians who were waiting to receive them outside of the gates of Akka prison, and the British refused to return their bodies to their families until the very, very end of the day at the last minute. And it was punitive because they knew there would be a huge funeral procession that would honor them as martyrs, and so they did not want that to happen. So even in its foundation, the corpse captivity policy and these practices of controlling the dead and controlling burial of Palestinians is rooted in colonial power and trying to exercise complete and total control over the bodies and lives of the indigenous population, of the Palestinian population, and using the dead body itself as a punishment over the living. So after, in 1948, Israel actually adopted the British emergency regulations that had basically codified the criminalization of Palestinian resistance into law. And that also included a regulation called Regulation 133, which stipulated that the authorities had the jurisdiction to conduct and determine burials of anyone under their rule. And this is actually the regulation which stems from the British that remains the legal foundation for the captive corpses policy today. And this is what Israel uses to justify the withholding of bodies for either a certain period of time to negotiate with the families to control how the burial will take place, such as in the case of Awdah, and how to determine if the burial will ever take place at all. And so what is even more sinister is that there's actually right now, according to the Jerusalem Legal Aid Center, who is documenting these cases, there's about 747 Palestinian dead bodies who Israel has explicitly refused to return to their families. Israel is the only state, or one of the only states, to have a legal policy to hold dead bodies hostage for the explicit purpose of using them as bargaining chips in political negotiations, to basically use the dead body to manipulate and exploit the emotional, social, and spiritual worlds of the living population for the purposes of continuing their settler colonial expansion. And so when Israel first started holding Palestinian bodies captive, it was more of an ad hoc and arbitrary practice during the Palestinian Revolution in the 1960s. They would take and bury the bodies of the Palestinian Fedaiyin, the revolutionary fighters who were mostly Palestinian refugees in exile, who were part of the armed struggle and who were trying to carry out armed resistance at the and come back into Palestine from the borders of Lebanon and Jordan. And then after, if there was clashes or after any of the battles, eyewitnesses would say that those bodies would be airlifted in helicopters and they would never be seen again. So initially, this practice was really arbitrary and ad hoc, and we didn't really know anything about it. And the families often would only find out about the death of their loved one from their comrades or from eyewitnesses. But in the Second Intifada, from 2000 to 2005, there was a turning point, and Israel started to use this policy more systematically and explicitly as a punishment. They were targeting the bodies of Palestinian fighters who were part of the armed wings of political groups and those who conducted martyrdom missions. And this is when the policy really became explicitly a tool of punishment against both the martyr, who would be denied an honorable burial or the ability to have a grave site, and also as a punishment for the families from being able to gain closure by burying or having any right to bury their loved ones or to like have any dignity of the dead or even just having some kind of closure. And then additionally, during this period, what we do know, and this continues to this day, is that Israel would extend the punishment to the family. Many of their families had their homes demolished or family members were arrested. I believe I heard this also happening in the case of Awdah, which is that some family members were arrested in the funeral tent, if is correct. Yeah. And so they are being collectively punished for the martyrs' act of resistance. And I think that like something to really remember here and is that as you mentioned also that there was an attempt to limit the number of people who can attend the funeral, where Awdah could be buried. I think initially they didn't even want him to be buried in Umm al Khair, but in a neighboring village. And this is very commonplace. And these are also all practices to try to destroy and erode Palestinian traditional burial rites and try to undermine Palestinian like indigenous presence on the land under constant erasure. It's so important in Palestinian tradition to be buried near the family. So the attempt to even try to bury Awdah outside of that is trying to rupture that kinship lineage between him and his family. And then finally, just to close off, is that the corpse captivity policy kind of halted after the Second Intifada, but then in 2015 and into the present, with the rise of anti-colonial rebellion amongst Palestinians, particularly young Palestinians in Jerusalem, who were starting to carry out or being accused of carrying out acts of resistance, for example, at checkpoints and against soldiers, Israel's reinstated this policy again as a way to punish them and punish their families. And then started codifying it more into the law to essentially extend it to criminalize the entire Palestinian population.
Yeah, I was just reading, actually, I was looking at Adalah's website a few days ago, and had a story about Awdah Hathaleen from East Jerusalem, who
Mhm.
was killed on the February 5th in 2024. He was a
Mhm.
14-year-old, and his body has also been withheld and until this day, and sort of they're using his body as a bargaining chip for further negotiations with Hamas or other things, and how these bodies are being used for other purposes. And you know, it's shocking that there is at least to my knowledge, but you probably know more, that at least 35 children are among these over 700 bodies that you have mentioned. And wondering, if you could talk a little bit about what that does to the family, what the impact of these types of practices, what is the objective
Mhm.
of this
Mhm. Mhm.
by the Israeli authorities?
Mhm. Yeah, I think, yeah, what you're touching on, how this affects the families and Palestinian society at large um, is really what is important here. And this is such like a severe and sinister form of punishment for these families. They're left in limbo, not oftentimes not knowing the fate of their children. I've documented cases where they actually don't know um, if their child had been killed or not because they had been taken. Like all that they knew is that they had been taken in a military vehicle at that point.
Mm.
So sometimes they would and this extends even back to the cases that I've documented from the 1960s that
So they never see the body. They don't even identify the body.
no,
Wow.
there's
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. There's sometimes they don't even know or believe
Yeah.
their child has actually been killed or not. And so sometimes they think that maybe they had been arrested or imprisoned. And there's, I mean, there's horrifying stories of mothers who I know who for decades, because they never saw the body and never actually received any confirmation from the state that their son had been killed. And they would actually be searching in prisons like across Palestine, across the Arab world, wondering if to see if they were actually still alive. It's actually had this policy even essentially holds the family and society captive at large to this power of death. Like I've documented stories where mothers say they don't leave their homes for long periods of time because they don't know if someone's going to come to the door and give them information about their child, or if their son or their daughter is to return to the home. So they don't want to leave their home
Oh,
in case that is going to happen. And there's others that have said that, that they've tried all different ways to kind of reconcile this grief, whether just, in their head saying that they feel like their child is traveling. And then the other thing that I think is really painful for them is that in this process of negotiation, sometimes the Israeli authorities will be negotiating with them and saying they will return the body, they won't return the body. And so this keeps reopening the wound. So even when they're trying to get closure, um,
yeah.
and like trying to reconcile this and trying to grieve and mourn, it still keeps reopening the wound for them, and they never are able to. They're basically held captive as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, in your academic work, you use this term of necroviolence, and I'm just wondering if you could sort of explain that a little bit more as a term that is used to describe this in other practices.
Hmm. Yeah, so the bigger literature that I was drawing from is called Necropolitics, and it's basically how the state uses the power over death to control a population. So the idea, and this is a concept developed by a South African scholar, Gilles Membe, where he talks about how sovereign power itself comes from the ability to determine death, and who must live and who must die and who can live. And that's been that concept of necropolitics, and it's been really helpful to kind of name and understand how Israel, as a colonial state, uses this ever-present looming possibility of death and destruction to control Palestinians. And we're seeing this every day unfolding in Gaza right now. And he uses, actually in his first piece that was written in 2003, he uses Gaza as an example, but it's about, like keeping the destruction of homes, constantly seeing the destruction of homes, the sounds of drones constantly buzzing over your head, determining if people can exit for medical treatment, the starvation policies. Israel determines the caloric intake of Palestinians, and are now explicitly starving Palestinians. So this is like the concept of necropolitics is controlling the world of the living through the dead. Um, and necroviolence kind of grows out of that concept of the sovereign control being focused on death. And it's a concept borrowed from another anthropologist, Jason De Leon, who works on like the borders between the US and Mexico, and people and migrants crossing the borders. And he defines necroviolence as the intentional mistreatment of a corpse in a way that is considered offensive, disrespectful, inhumane. And he talks about the destruction and disappearance of the corpse and how it has social effects on the living, because people have to start renegotiating what the meaning of death is and what the meaning of their traditional burial practices are in the absence of the corpse. And these concepts have been really helpful for me, especially because I talked about I talked earlier about who's actually being held under the captive corpses policy. It's oftentimes those who are considered carrying out acts of anti-colonial resistance against the state, from the 1960s into the present. But they are actually their bodies are actually being held in this series of these clandestine grave sites in closed military zones. They were negligently buried, sometimes buried in mass graves or bodies on top of one another, in these grave sites. And we only know this we've begun to know more and more about this in like the last decade, but for a very, very long time, Israel even denied that these cemeteries existed. And so these cemeteries are completely neglected. They're desecrated. There's like animals that are grazing on top of them. There's erosion of soil that has meant that a lot of the bodies have moved. And essentially, what has happened is that these bodies have become part of the topography and have become part of the environment. They're no longer able to be identified or found. And that has been a lot of the Palestinian families believe that Israel never intended to return these captive bodies to them, and that they've actually just degraded them into the land and into the soil as an act of disappearing them. And so this
And
is kind of
these cemeteries aren't places that people can even go and visit, right? They're like in military zones and so, and if
exactly.
you believe that your son was buried in a mass grave somewhere as part of the disappeared, you know, you might want to go to a site and at least sort of, visit maybe a site where your son may have been killed, may have been
Mhm.
buried, but I mean, my understanding is they're unreachable. These are areas that that people can't even reach. Is that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they are enclosed military zones. We know of two that are currently active that are along the Jordan Valley. One is on Jisr Adam and one is on Jisr Banat Yaqub. So they are, first of all, for Palestinians from the West Bank, and of course for Palestinian refugees who are in exile. These sites are completely impossible to enter. Israel calls them the cemeteries of the enemy dead. They're highly surveilled. They're in military zones. Palestinians call them the cemeteries of numbers, Maqabir al-Arqam, because from what we know is that actually each of these grave sites had a numbered marker on them that was supposed to identify who was buried there. However, that information has never been revealed to Palestinians. And we don't even know if that information is accurate. And so that's why they call them the cemeteries of numbers. But essentially, and I think this is what is important, is that these bodies and these martyrs have been reduced to numbers, have been reduced into being part of the land as an act of disappearance because it's trying to sever them from being part of the Palestinian society. And I think that's also part of what is the settler colonial practice here, is trying to erase the indigenous from the land by erasing who they were as a person, what their meaning was, what they were fighting for, how they died, if it was in battle for fighting for Palestine, for example. And so that's also part of these practices, is trying to erase this Palestinian history on the land. And it's, I think, there's a Palestinian scholar, Abdulrahman al-Sheikh, who calls this the subterranean Nakba, of trying to erase the ways that like Palestinians exist, because burial sites, of course, everywhere globally in the world tell you who has been living on that land. They are physical markers of the history of that land. So to be able to take those to erase, like to not allow people to be buried with their families or to be buried in their communities, is a way to try to erase the history of that land. And in Gaza, we also saw this since the beginning of the genocide. Israel has been raising cemeteries that are hundreds of years old. And this is also part and parcel of this project of trying to erase the Palestinian.
Yeah, I mean, as we talk about, I want to go back to Gaza, of course, because it's front and center in our minds and in what everything that's happening right now. But even less than 2 weeks ago, when the women who were mourning in the mourning tent for Awdah, one of them said one of her concerns was that the settler who killed Awdah, who is trying to extend the settlement next door into an area that would separate the village into upper al Khair and lower al Khair. She lives close to that border, but said behind my house there's a small cemetery for 9 children who were buried there. And her worry and was concern was a desecration of the cemetery. And it just brings everything back to this reality sort of everywhere. So we talk about the cemeteries from the Nakba era of 48, all these villages that were razed and destroyed, and where are the cemeteries? And then the villages that there are remnants, like Lifta. You can go to Lifta and the cemetery is there, and there are people who are originally from Lifta who try and go and maintain the cemetery and clean it up, and they're attacked whenever they try and do that. And so this theme continues, sort of the erasure and the desecration of life and death. And I think what you described in the language of necropolitics exactly describes everything that is happening in Gaza now. And Randa, as I think about your work, and you have spent years looking at these issues, and it's very hard for us now to be everyday living with this death, waking up to it, seeing it. And the stories are beyond horrific, to the point that I feel like I can't even repeat them. I mean, some of them, we've seen children with carrying body parts of their parents in bags. I mean, things like that that are just so horrendous. And then the desecration of all these cemeteries and how I mean I think of the work that you have done and how did you manage to live with so much death in your work every day? Um,
Mhm.
it's very hard. I mean, it's very hard for all of us now. I think we don't know how we are going to emerge from this. We are all changed forever.
Mhm.
Um, and we are still in the midst of it. And I don't know if if there's anything that from your experience of delving deep into the questions of death and how we talk about it at this moment. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah. Sorry, it's a difficult question, and
Yeah.
maybe there is no answer, but I just you're strong.
I don't know. I don't know if I have any good insights to share. I share your feeling, and what is happening in Gaza is unfolding on this scale. Even studying death and like being immersed in this world and writing about death and meeting with families who are grieving, nothing I think could have prepared me for what we are witnessing every single day. And you're right, it's completely changed us, and I don't know what after looks like, and I don't know how we recover from this. And I don't think I could have ever anticipated or really known how to deal with this level of death and destruction. And lately it's something that was different than my research is, and what's been really affecting me is watching the slow death of people from starvation. I think it's hard to put into words. I think that's just even a different level of pain that we're witnessing that is so difficult to reconcile. And I was watching an interview with this doctor, Dr. Tariq Lubani, who's in Gaza, and he was saying that, like, just to go back to the concept of necropolitics and necroviolence, he was saying that actually at the humanitarian aid sites, there are just bodies that are strewn all around of people who had been killed who that they can't even retrieve.
Yeah,
And so like imagine like I feel like I've often gone into this mindset where I'm trying to even imagine what that moment is like to just be literally seeing like the looming presence of death constantly every day. When trying to go even to the humanitarian aid sites, which we know are death zones, basically. Um, like you said, Hillary, like I think this has like really affected me and changed me as a person. And I think it's great that so many people of conscious have like now stand with Palestine and are hearing what we have been saying for decades, for generations about what we are experiencing as the Palestinian people. But I feel really angry, I think, more than ever, having studied this, that Palestinians in Gaza have had to pay this price for this global awakening. And
yeah,
I think I'm always going to be angry about that.
yeah,
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 but just, you know, we've been talking about like the mechanisms that Israel is using, and about necropolitics and necroviolence and these horrors that we're witnessing, every day. And I think like these concepts and tracking them, these are really generative to like understand these mechanisms of settler colonial control. And as someone who was studying this from the perspective of being in the American Academy, I think it was really important for me to like document all of these stories, and all of the stories of the martyrs and the families, and the different legal codes that Israel was using to control the bodies of the dead. But when I was writing about when I was writing my dissertation, and when I've been writing about this, I think when doing that documentation and writing about necropolitics and necroviolence, I think just talking about it from that angle, we can have a blind spot and miss a really important part of the story, which is like all the different ways that Palestinians continue to resist and endure
Yep.
and survive. And so that really became a way that for me to deal with writing about death and writing
Wow.
about like these mechanisms that felt like they were so stifling and strangling us. And so, a lot of my research, I was meeting with the families of martyrs from the 1960s, pretty much to the present, until about 2022. And just learning about their loved one and learning about all the different ways that they've dealt with the corpse captivity policy, how they've reconciled it, if they had tried to get to try to get the bodies back using the courts or other means. Just that was a lot of my work was meeting with these families and trying to understand how this policy affects Palestinian society. And so then when I went back and I was writing about necropolitics and necroviolence, I really realized that their story and all the different ways that they were refusing to be beholden to death worlds. And even though they had immense grief and pain, which every mother who loses a child, like that's life changing. And they were refusing to be beholden to the power of what Israel was trying to control of them, which was their dignity and the dignity of the dead, and trying to punish them. So they were constantly finding ways to defy that. And that's ultimately what like helped me work through this. And I think what is a really important part of this story is that they were always talking about different ways that they were resisting Israel's control over them. Whether that was standing up to the soldiers when they came to demolish their homes, or when they were like, calling their son a terrorist, and they were like fighting back and saying, no, he's a martyr, he's a freedom fighter, or even if they were going into the long battles in the courts and insisting on using that. Or there were cases where families just said, like, we're going to find closure on our own. We're not even going to deal with this state. We know they're trying to negotiate with us as a way to control us. Some mothers would tell me, the way that they reconciled with not being able to bury their son is that he ultimately was buried in the 1948 territories. He actually carried out the right of return
He
in
returned.
death. And so they
Wow.
said, like, we don't need to get the body back. He's actually realized Palestinian liberation.
Yeah.
And so I think, these stories are so critical because they were all finding, and all of them were so different, of course, but they were all finding ways to continue to keep the dignity of the dead in the absence of the traditions that we carry that are supposed to define what dignity of the dead means.
Yeah.
And they were keeping their own dignity. So they were not allowing Israel to control that from them at all. And that really like taught me this. It felt like this was like a collective form of defiance. These were all like various different anti-colonial, decolonial practices that the families were carrying out. And it really showed how they were defining dignity for themselves and redefining it and denying Israel the ability to conquer that territory and that place inside of them, and that Israel could not dominate this last terrain
Yeah.
of what it means to be Palestinian. Because ultimately, this policy is meant, it kind of goes beyond territorial control, right? It's meant to control the inner worlds of Palestinians. It's meant to control their existential worlds of what death means. And it's meant to control their cosmological worlds of what it means to have a Islamic burial and how important that is. And so they were not allowing that to happen. And I think that's what you were talking about with the women in Umm al Khair who had a
Yes.
hunger strike. This was their way of
Mhm.
defying Israel by saying we're going to fight to bury the body on our terms.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly an example. And I mean, as you were speaking, I was recalling, images, through stories and poetry and so on coming out of Gaza, because of the impossibility in some cases to have these burials of, um, imagining, children as angels flying, in the sky, imagining. I mean, Rifat's Al-Arir's poem is also, about these kites and sort of this a different way of remembering but upholding and holding on to your dignity. And I think
Mhm,
we will, this is a unfortunately an expanding topic. It's
mhm,
one that we will be talking about for many years. And
mhm,
but I think it's I love how you bring it back to dignity, and that I think is important to hold on to. If
mhm.
people are doing these practices, their voice is present throughout all this pain, throughout all this horror. And
Mhm.
so I this is a difficult conversation, but I'm so glad that we had it. And I think um, I am so appreciative of your work and of you sharing it with us. I think we have so much to learn, and unfortunately, we have to talk about these topics. But
Mhm.
I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and for sharing your work, and giving us language, and understanding this long-term practice and where it came from. So I
Yeah.
want to thank you for that. Thank you, Randa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wish we didn't have to
Yeah,
write or talk about this.
yeah,
And yeah, thank you for giving me the platform to talk about this. And I hope that we continue to really think about the long-term implications of these practices and finding ways for us to be collectively um, being there for each other and remaking what it means to find closure, so that we can continue to resist these horrifying and cruel practices of the Israeli state. Because I really think what is keeping us all going collectively and what is really driving Zionism crazy is that the insistence of Palestinians in Gaza to continue to find life amidst all of these death worlds that they've created. I mean, I was watching a video of this little baby who had like crawled out of his tent, and his mom was like playing peekaboo with him. And he was just like giggling so much. And, he looks like he's like about a year old. Like he has literally never experienced life outside of a genocide, and he's still
yeah,
finding ways to laugh, and his mom is like, playing with him. And I just felt like, for me, it's like those small moments that continue to, and finding ways to continue to um, resist this
absolutely.
degradation
Yeah.
that they are trying to enforce on us, that is keeping us going. And I gained so much inspiration from the people in Gaza, and that's what keeps me going too. And I know we have to continue fighting until our last breath for the end of this genocide and for the freedom of Palestine. And those are the moments that keep me going.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Today, similarly, I saw this video of a teacher and students from the Edward Said Conservatory of Music, Gaza branch. And the teacher was, um, he was saying, we're hearing these drones, around us all the time. And he mimicked the sound of the drones, and then he sort of started humming, and then he started singing, and then the children behind him started singing. And wow, such power in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of wow, uh, destruction and violence. So that, yeah, exactly what you were saying. It helps us keep going, but we also have to keep our, our eyes on everything that's happening, and it doesn't justify any of this. So we will keep fighting for justice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thank you, Randa, so much for opening up this opportunity for this conversation. And I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other rich content related to Palestine, Israel. And please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find it on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. You can also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I'm Hilary Rantisi, signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts. Thank you, everyone.